Hi, welcome to our monthly webinar where today we're going to talk about why FDA cybersecurity submissions fail. We've got Trevor Slattery here, our CTO. He'll be doing most of it. The talking, I'm coming to you from the health conference in Las Vegas. Just stepped away from our booth for a while. So if you're in health or know anybody health, we have a booth there. Feel free to direct them to our booth. It's 951.3. It's a funny booth number. Cool. We'll turn it over to you, Trevor, and we can dive right into it.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm just getting these slides pulled up here. This is going to be an exciting one. So we're talking about why some of these cybersecurity submissions may fail and what you should look at to make sure that you aren't encountering some of these mistakes that we've seen in the past. We'll also talk about some of the early action strategies that you can take to make sure that you're de-risking your FDA cybersecurity submissions, as well as some of the case studies that we've seen as some dangerous examples during some of our submissions that we've helped deal with the deficiency response on the back end. The first thing that we want to talk about is going to be the importance of cybersecurity. So cybersecurity is a little bit of a new hot topic when it comes to the regulatory process, FDA submissions, but it seems to be just about what's on everyone's mind at this point. It's currently one of the most common reasons for medical devices to get rejected by the FDA is cybersecurity deficiencies. So we want to make sure that we are doing this in a very safe, in a very secure, in a traceable and repeatable manner. This is a critical element of ensuring that we have quality within our software and safety within our products. Security and safety are intrinsically tied together within the medical space, which is unique to this industry. You aren't going to see the same intersections in, say, finance or, say, legal considerations, where cybersecurity is still extremely important, just with different metrics that we're looking at. These regulations are getting tighter by the day. The FDA is very conscious of how risky cybersecurity can be when it's mishandled in medical devices, and they're constantly working on updating their guidance, updating eSTAR to make sure that they're staying on the cutting edge of cybersecurity requirements. Now, the FDA is really on the cutting edge of these requirements. Compared to some of the global regulators, the FDA does their best to set the bar for cybersecurity expectations and oftentimes act as a superset of many of the other regulators, or you may see during your regulatory process that once you get through FDA, everything's going to be streamlined from there. While, of course, every agency has its own unique differences, each country is looking for their own special areas with cybersecurity, the FDA is definitely leading the charge on that front. When we mishandle cybersecurity, this can be a huge problem. This can lead to delays, rejections, loss in trust around your product. And what we want to do is step in and figure this out right the first time instead of dealing with it on the back end. Now, what the FDA likes to talk about and other regulators like to talk about is the total product lifecycle approach. This is essentially saying all the way from design to decommission, or a shift left approach, meaning earlier in the design phase, we should start addressing and thinking about cybersecurity. This is very important to understand where we start with this total product lifecycle. And when we're saying design, this should be before you've started any work on actually building your product, you should start thinking about your cybersecurity strategy. If you're leaving this to the end, you can't treat it as a single point in time study where you go through certain testing, you have your results, and then you move forward. If you do not consider cybersecurity until the very end, the testing, the documentation is going to be extremely difficult, and you're going to find yourself without a lot of the information that the regulators are going to require. What we want to do, and the easiest way to go about this, is with standardized approaches. So the JSP2 is a great framework for building out security in medical devices. ISO IEC 81001-5-1 operates in a slightly different capacity, but is still talking about this development lifecycle and this development process where we're building secure products, we're building them in a safe way, and we're doing this in a clear, documented, and repeatable manner. I once heard that cybersecurity is just evidence of quality software. And that's something that I wholeheartedly agree with. If you have a secure product, if you have secure code built into your product, that should be evidence that you have taken due diligence to build a good product. You are going through all of the steps that the FDA wants to see. And it's a good look to the regulators as well for the whole submission to see that you have these considerations in mind. Now, another part with this total product lifecycle approach is going to be your risk management approaches. Now, we believe that risk management is something that should be done even before this design and development of the product. Risk management is very, very important to have in place before we start doing any actual design, any actual writing of the code, building out of the product, since we don't know when problems are going to come up. You could be lucky, you could get through multiple different design cycles and different design phases without seeing any risks introduced into the system, though in our experience, this is rarely the case. You want to have a very clear process for managing risk in your product, conducting repeatable risk assessments with a safety and security intersection before these problems come up. So the ideal situation is that we implement our risk management frameworks at the very beginning, start looking at these standardized development approaches, and then we have A, a process that is ideally going to introduce minimal risk into the system, and B, a process that helps us safely and repeatably mitigate problems as they come up in the system.
So we're looking at design to disposal, I like to say.
Exactly. And even before some of the design, and this ultimately goes into talking about your quality system considerations or just overall quality considerations within a medical product, is looking at this risk management ahead of any of the actual design choices. Now, the reason that we talk about the development process and this total product lifecycle approach is when we're actually looking at risk management, this is something that your organization is going to adhere to. You'll, of course, map it to specific products, but overall, this should be a process that you can repeat across many different product lines. Now, there are many different types of risks that may be present within a medical device: safety, security, business, financial risk. The main ones that we're going to want to talk about are safety and security. So for safety risk management, we turn to ISO 14971 as the golden standard for safety risk management. This is going to be standard across multiple different industries and is a very clear, repeatable process for identifying safety risks in products. Now, this is not just going to be gated to security problems. You may identify during an FMEA exercise that there are certain unacceptable safety risks in the product that have no mapping to security in any way. Similarly, the inverse may be true. And this is when we start talking about AMI TR 57, and then as a new predecessor that they're starting to work towards a little bit more of a shift, AMI SW 96. Now, the FDA still talks about AMI TR 57 as one of the preferred methodologies for going through this process. And one thing that we really like to do is talk about how are we getting this intersection between safety and security. During the risk management phase, there's a specific point following an AMI TR 57 risk management framework where we say, are we doing a cross evaluation for safety risks within the product? Notably, we are not talking about a cross evaluation with business risk. We're not talking about this financial risk. So it becomes apparent how security risks in a medical device can introduce a safety problem. If we can compromise the security of a product, that likely means that we're going to alter the confidentiality, availability, integrity of the product, or can directly lead to patient harm. These are all going to be safety considerations as well as security. So that's why we need to have this intersection. Now, having said that, this may not always be the case. Oftentimes, we'll pick an easy example. If you can disclose PHI from a medical device, this is not inherently a safety risk. This is a security and a data risk, and of course, a regulatory and business risk. But we cannot directly harm an individual by taking personal information from them. We can have sensitive information that is protected under HIPAA that we should not be disclosing, but it is not tangible harm. So we wouldn't have that cross intersection. Now, when we're looking at AMI TR 57, one thing that we commonly see as some mistakes is that manufacturers are building out risk management frameworks without this focus on direct harm to an individual or a patient. And that's why we need to have this intersection in place. AMI TR 57 does not explicitly talk about introducing harm into individuals. It talks about the intersection of safety risk. This is why we should have two distinct separate processes that, of course, do have some blend in certain situations, but in general should be thought of as separate entities. Next thing that I like to talk about is security by design. Now, this ties back into the total product lifecycle approach, but should more be focused on during the design and implementation phase. Now, the FDA wants to see that we're building security into the product with a secure product development framework instead of trying to nail it on at the end. We can look at a great standard for following this process is IEC 62304. which breaks devices into different safety classifications, class A, B, and C, which is going to be traditionally the European method for classifying devices. FDA goes with class 1, 2, and 3, though in most cases, they're going to have a lot of overlap. When we have these different risk profiles, there are different controls and different considerations that we should have at the front of mind, and we should think about building into these products. You can easily imagine that a pacemaker might not have the same risk profile as an oxygen pump, or as a surgical robot, or as a continuous glucose monitor. So understanding this scaling risk-based approach, knowing what controls are going to be sufficient depending on your level of overall risk, your system and environmental assumptions within the product are all very important considerations. When we're in this design phase, it's easiest to do this as part of your requirements. So the first thing that you'll do for building out your requirements is, what does the product need to do? Your functional requirements. The next thing that you need to think about is, how does it need to do it? This will be your non-functional requirements. And finally, how does it do it safely and securely? These will be your security requirements. Not only is it very important to have these built out as part of your medical device process, as part of your quality system documentation, but it is actually a requirement for the FDA submissions to have test cases and traceability to these security requirements. So a great example we can think of would be a login page on a software as a medical device product hosted within a cloud environment. The functional requirement is users have to be able to log into an application. If we have the non-functional requirement, they might use it through a certain JavaScript framework. The security requirement around this would be that passwords must be of a certain complexity and length. We'll say 12 characters long, upper and lowercase, numbers and letters, and special characters. So that would be an example of tying a security requirement back to a functional product requirement. I'd like to talk about a couple of common mistakes that we see when going through this process, when building out medical devices without security in mind. Now, the very first thing that I want to mention, and is likely one of the most common reasons that we see the FDA kick back medical devices or raise concerns with submissions, is that risk assessment methodologies are not considering patient harm or objective exploitability metrics. This is outlined in AAMI TIR 57, this is outlined in AAMI SW 96, this is outlined in the FDA Cybersecurity guidance, and pretty much any standard talking about medical devices says we need to have exploitability metrics. We need to look at patient harm as our paramount concern, as opposed to looking at traditional cybersecurity metrics, confidentiality, integrity, availability being the most common three, the CIA triad.
So the common mistake is most people apply a IT cybersecurity or traditional cybersecurity risk methodology to medical devices, is what you're saying.
Correct, yes.
Which is why we say traditional cybersecurity, which you talked about, the CIA triad, is very different than medical device cybersecurity, because there's the harm to the patient, which is not included in CIA.
Exactly. So if we think about where it's easy to map CIA, financial data is a very easy example. There aren't that many situations where with a financial model, you can find risk outside of the confidentiality of data, the integrity of the data, and the availability of the process. There isn't going to be a tangible harm to an individual if you steal their credit card information. You can't break someone's leg by getting their PIN to their bank account. So it is a great methodology for mapping traditional risk in traditional IT scenarios. It just does not map very well to medical applications.
Right.
Now, the other thing in this area that we're talking about is these exploitability metrics. So this is a bit of a unique term. And oftentimes, even talking to people who've been in the industry for quite some time, it's new within the medical space. The FDA hasn't really started talking about it until recently. So exploitability metrics can be thought of as criteria that must be true for an attack to be exploited or an attacker to be successful. For an example, we might say, well, what level of access do you need? Do you have to physically touch the device? Can you attack it from the other room? What about from another state? What about from a different network? What about from a whole other country? What level of access do we need? Does someone else need to be using the device while we break into it? Does someone need to click a poisoned link? The goal here is that we have objective metrics that everyone will agree on. So you pick any two individuals off the street and have them conduct the same risk assessment. they're going to come to the same conclusion because they're seeing the same criteria go into place. This is to prevent the situation of saying, where I'm conducting a risk assessment and I say, I think it has a 1 in 10,000 chance of occurring. And Christian says, I think it has a 1 in 50,000 chance of occurring. And then who's to say who's right? It's simply going to be my word against his and us trying to prove our points one way or another, as opposed to having a concrete and objective set of criteria that we know has to be true for this to happen. Now, what we utilize are the exploitability metrics from CVSS 4.0, Common Vulnerability Scoring System. This is a long-time system that's been used in cybersecurity that talks about some of these metrics that must be in place for a vulnerability to be exploited. Now, while we're using these exploitability metrics from CVSS, we aren't relying too much on the impact metrics since, again, they are not considering patient harm. So we're having a little bit of a hybrid approach here that we use to conduct our risk assessments to make sure that we have complete coverage. Another very common mistake that we see is cybersecurity testing not being done against the full product scope. Now, what do we mean when we say product scope? We'll pick a very common situation that we see, or a very common infrastructure setup for a medical device. You'll have a wearable, maybe it's a watch, maybe it's a ring, whatever it might be. Excuse me. This is going to connect to a mobile application on your cell phone. That mobile application is going to talk to a cloud server hosted in AWS or in Google Cloud Provider. And where are the boundaries of your medical device? Is the phone part of the device? Is AWS part of the device? Do you need to consider that cloud server at all? What about the mobile application? The device itself is only the wearable. So understanding where the boundary is very important. And while, of course, it's going to be implementation specific and every device is going to have a unique boundary, what you can think of as the general rule of thumb is what do you control and what do you need to have in the device? For an example, let's say if you have an optional accessory that may or may not be used with the device, it helps provide an extra view on some of the data or something like that. That may not be considered fully in scope for the medical device. But if you have this setup where you need that cloud server to work for that wearable device scenario, that cloud infrastructure that you have is going to be part of the medical device. But AWS itself and your AWS backend and the actual cloud infrastructure behind the application and behind the server running this analysis might be considered out of scope. Similarly, the mobile application running on the phone will definitely be in scope. But are you providing the phone or are customers bringing their own phones? There's only so much you can control if customers bring their own phones. If you're providing this to users, then you're responsible for the security. So this is a very complicated issue and there's no easy answer to it, but it's a very common problem to misscope medical devices or not conduct a full array of testing. NIST Special Publication 800-115 talks about a full laundry list of different types of security tests to go through. Fuzz testing, penetration testing, robustness testing, abuse case testing, misuse case testing, vulnerability chaining, vulnerability assessments, static testing, dynamic testing, the list goes on. If we aren't covering all of our bases in this process, it's going to show the FDA that we have not done a comprehensive job with cybersecurity.
You sound exhausted, Trevor, listing off all the requirements.
There are a lot of them. It's a lot of testing to go through. I think our testing team is the one more exhausted with executing all of those tests.
Yeah.
But it's really important to have all of them. Every single one of them is looking for something different. For an example, with fuzz testing, you're looking at specific inputs to see when it breaks, if you give it weird input in one way or another, where with a vulnerability assessment, it's kind of this quick high-level scan to check packages, check your operating system. Everything is looking at it from a different perspective, trying to achieve different goals. So having all of them is really important for coverage. Another common problem that we see is risk assessment methodologies not being separate and distinct processes. It's very common for manufacturers to say, we're going to see risk in the product. Of course, you're going to see risk in the product. We're in healthcare. It's all about managing risk and managing complications and health problems. But what we need to do is break these out. We talked about how there are some intersection points for sure, but these need to be separate, distinct processes. You can't just say, we're going to lump every risk into this assessment framework. You might not need to calculate patient harm if you're thinking about business risk. You don't need to calculate the financial loss if you're thinking about safety impact. So having these as separate processes catered to what they need to do is very, very important.
So let me ask you something, because as you were talking, you mentioned earlier about thinking about the risk during the requirements phase. Should a manufacturer also think about the risk to damage to reputation if their device is hacked and things of that nature as well? Because we've been talking about patient safety, but there's obviously other economic and financial and reputational risk to a manufacturer as well.
Definitely. And it's something that comes up fairly often. Even recently, there was quite a large lawsuit filed by the Department of Justice and the FDA against a very large medical device manufacturer that had falsified some claims relating to their cybersecurity. This provided a seriously negative impact on that manufacturer. A lot of our clients were coming to us saying they're concerned about seeing what's happened to this manufacturer. They're concerned about working with them for some of their products. They want to make sure that they have all of their bases covered. So there is a very big risk to mismanaging cybersecurity, obviously a much larger risk to falsifying cybersecurity. But from a business perspective, I mentioned at the very start of this, cybersecurity is one of, I believe it is actually the most common reason for medical devices to get rejected by the FDA right now.
Yeah.
If you're not taking this seriously, your timeline's going to go way pushed back. We've seen deficiencies go for as long as 12 months. And that's a little bit of an outlier for sure, but 3 to 6 months all the time. This is time where you're not on the market. This is time where you have to deal with not only fixing the medical product, but you have to deal with the public image. You have to deal with your investor relations. You have to go to the board and say, hey, we're 6 months delayed on product release. It's a big problem if you run into cybersecurity deficiencies.
Yeah, and going back and asking your investors for more money when they thought had come up with a decent roadmap is kind of a frustrating scenario is for everybody.
Exactly. Yep. And I know we always talk about how rarely we see manufacturers build out cybersecurity into their roadmaps. And I was even talking to some investors this past week down in San Jose at Device Talks West, and similar situation to what we always encounter. Cybersecurity is something that might be mentioned, but it's not always called out in a roadmap for the number one reason for devices getting rejected. So it's definitely something that needs to be pushed to front of mind.
Well, that's why we're doing these webinars in our podcast to help raise that awareness, because we want to see these devices get to market quickly and securely.
Exactly. And overall, secure devices are going to provide better care to the patients. They're going to provide better security for hospitals. This prevents situations coming up from hospitals getting ransomware if we have secure products within the hospital that can't act as patient zero for the ransomware virus. All right. Now, another problem that I like to talk about that we very frequently see are critical cybersecurity controls. The FDA has a list of the main cybersecurity controls that they look at: authentication, authorization, cryptography, confidentiality, event detection and logging, update mechanisms. They're really looking at how we're handling some of the core functionalities within the device and building security in mind there. Now, the list that the FDA provides, they have the full list within their FDA guidance for cybersecurity in medical devices, and they mention that this is a non-exhaustive list. If you have specific controls, specific implementations, or device changes that build out that security posture, you should document this. You should implement this properly. You should document it properly. And very oftentimes what we'll see is for all of these controls, there's just no documentation. Even if there's an implementation, there might not be an implementation at all, but very often all of these controls are in place in one way or another through just best coding practices. The development team understands they need to do it and they do it, but it's not documented well. So then the FDA says, we don't see that you have any encryption in your medical device. Come back and say, oh, well, we do. It's very strong encryption, actually. It's up to the latest standard. We're using something like AES 256, which is the latest and greatest types of encryption methodologies. And then the FDA will come back and say, well, we didn't see any evidence of that. Where was it documented? So what you're building out for your security controls, make sure that they're comprehensively documented. If you have anything unique to your device, it only helps to show the FDA that you're taking additional precautions for security and safety. It's going to look good in your submission. They're going to be happy with it, and you'll be happy with the outcome. Another common issue that we see is risk management principles not being applied across the total product lifecycle. Now, cybersecurity is a very unique type of testing. It's a very unique part of the submission since it's largely exploratory as opposed to you're testing against a benchmark. For emissions testing, for your 60601 testing, you're saying there's a threshold. This level of emissions is intolerable. This level is acceptable. This level of EMC interference is intolerable. This level is tolerable. With cybersecurity, it is essentially we're going to find out what's wrong, assess that, and then we're going to find a tailored approach to fix it. There's no one set of baselines. You can't just say, oh, I ticked all of the control boxes, the device is secure, since every device is unique in that way. When we think about this, we think about how unique devices are and the fact that we're doing some of this exploratory testing, we can't treat it as a single point in time snapshot. We aren't just trying to pass a test. We have to apply security risk management from the very start, from design to decommission, like you always say, or design to disposal. So if we are treating this as a point in time snapshot or just treating it like a study, we're mapping risk management once, and it's likely going to lead to a disaster when we go through this risk assessment and we find so many problems. Instead of mapping it through the full total product life cycle of the device, where your penetration tester comes in towards the end, around 6 months out from submission, and then says, yeah, you've been doing a good job at covering your bases with security all the way through. And so we're not seeing as much as we'd usually see on these devices. And that's the best case scenario. That usually means that you're near the finish line and you should be on a good track to getting FDA clearance. The next thing that we often see is that controls are not going to be sufficiently robust based on the risk classification of the device and the intended use environment. The use environment is a very, very important one to talk about. I'll bring up an example for the inverse where controls were too sufficient for the use environment. This was a medical device. It was an insert into an MRI machine. And that's something when we went on site to conduct this assessment and have my bag full of all sorts of computers and different tools to try to hack into the device. And we stop and they say, okay, nothing magnetic can enter the room or it's going to spike a hole through the MRI machine and wipe your laptops completely. I go, well, I like my laptops. I don't want them to get wiped completely, so I probably can't bring it near the MRI. And we couldn't have any metal on us entering that room. And so you stop and you think, now what can you do to the medical device in that room? You probably can't access it at all. So what controls are going to be in place that we would recommend instead? How can we prevent people from taking it out of the room became our paramount concern. So we quite literally just padlocked it into the wall, and then there's no way to get it out of that room at that point. You can't bring a computer up to it. You can't bring it to a computer. Now, this was a large system. There were components outside of that room, which we had to conduct the security assessment on. But the point being is that where you're using the device is an important classification and consideration. Similarly, understanding your risk profile. An imaging device is not directly interacting with the patient. It's saying, here's what we see. Usually, these are going to be lower risk products. Excuse me. If we compare that to a surgical robot used in open surgery, there's a massive risk profile there. If anything goes wrong, it could lead to severe harm or even the death of a patient. So controls that might be totally fine for an X-ray machine would not work at all for a surgical robot. And we need to understand that there's a little bit of sliding scale there when thinking about this. Now, we talked about some of the common mistakes that we've seen, but what happens when those mistakes happen? There are a lot of risks from when we're delaying cybersecurity. One of the major ones that we see are going to be cost overruns. Trying to retrofit security onto a completed product is very hard. Oftentimes you're in a design freeze. It doesn't make sense to go through a whole new round of verification and validation. So you're so limited on what controls you can implement. Often they need to be physical changes to the hardware of the product, which is going to be pretty expensive compared to software changes. You might need to just bite the bullet and go through this full round of new V&V testing. And in general, what we're seeing is that when we're dealing with this later on, it's much more difficult and much more expensive than building security in the first time. It can also lead to delayed time to market. If the FDA pushes back your product, says that you need to come back with more cybersecurity, says that worst case scenario, they reject the device altogether, this is time where you're going to need to go back, make a bunch of changes and fixes, come back to the FDA and go through that approval process again. This can take a lot of time. FDA can take a little bit of time to get to the review cycle. Even within the review cycle, there can be some delays and back and forth, so we want to avoid this where possible. Now, the worst case scenario is going to be an FDA rejection if they state that they don't want to approve a new product or they do not see your product as substantially equivalent under the 510(k) program, or we just run out the clock during a 6-month review cycle. It's the worst case scenario, but if we come to the table with insufficient documentation, insufficient testing, 6 months is not as much time as you would think to fix all of these, especially with more complicated systems. Oftentimes, it can't be feasible if you have significant design overhauls to make for the product, since you'll have to go through a new round of verification and validation testing. We want to cover cybersecurity early so that we don't come to this scenario down the line. Something that is not always spoken of is the loss of investor trust that can happen due to mismanagement of the process. Now, we've talked about how uncommon it can be to see cybersecurity built into pitch decks and built into roadmaps. And it really is surprising. Like I've said a couple times during this webinar, it is one of the most common reasons that medical devices get rejected. And it's not something that we're talking about. So if we come back to our investors and say, we need more money, we got kicked back by the FDA, this is going to take another 6 months. They go, well, why did you get kicked back by the FDA? What did you need to do to prepare better for this? So we want to convey trust, convey competence and ability to our investors, make sure that they're feeling confident for the process and that we are getting through it confidently. Now, I've alluded a little bit to this area in some of these other points, but difficult to implement fixes are very, very costly as far as time delays. If we identify that we can't fix something outside of a design freeze without a new round of verification and validation testing, the whole timeline is going to get pushed back, since we're going to need to redo software documentation on top of cybersecurity documentation. So problems within cybersecurity can bleed out into the other parts of a regulatory submission if we aren't covering this early. Now, finally, this is a little bit of an obvious one, but if you're not cleared to be on the market, you can't sell your product on the market. If you cannot get through the FDA clearance process in a timely fashion, you're not going to be able to start generating revenue from this product. It can go pretty fast when you're burning through runway trying to get through the regulatory process, and any delays that are pushing you back 6 months, 12 months can be fatal to an early stage startup. So we want to make sure that we get this device to market as quickly as possible, and we're able to sell it, and it's safe and secure when it's pushed out into the field. The next thing that we have are a couple of case studies where we'll talk about some real situations that we've seen and we've helped some of our clients get through. So this is one example that I like to refer to as the can of worms. The long story short of this problem was that the FDA came back with a couple initial concerns around the submission process, mostly around how the risk assessment was conducted. And this was just a small issue that they identified. We're using probability instead of exploitability. The device manufacturer comes to us, asks for our assistance to start fitting it to exploitability and work with the FDA's deficiencies. But as we do that, the FDA starts pulling onto this thread, and they're saying, well, now that we're looking a little bit deeper into this, you're missing these controls. This implementation is insecure. We don't like how you're integrating into existing environments. And it ended up leading to some significant design overhauls of the medical device. We had to go through full new rounds of testing since previous testing was deemed out of date. It became a whole long process with 12 full months of FDA interactive review before we finally got this product cleared for market, all because the FDA identified one deficiency that they started to look into a little bit more and start pulling on that thread. When we're providing quality documentation, it's evidence to the regulators that we are doing a good job at covering our bases. If they're going to start seeing a couple of mistakes here and there, they're going to start picking into the rest of the submission packet and diving in a lot deeper. We want to make sure that we're showing up with a strong effort the first time, as opposed to trying to go back and fix things in interactive review. Showing up the first time with a strong offering is going to let the FDA just breeze you through the submission process. Very often, and actually pretty recently, we were working with a client where the FDA came back with 0 questions in their entire packet, and they actually got through from submission to clearance in about 3 weeks. That was the fastest I have ever heard of the FDA clearing a medical device. And just goes to show, when you have all your bases covered for your full regulatory process, the FDA is going to find a lot less to grab onto. All right, another example that I like to talk about that we very recently dealt with was insufficient testing. And we have a little snapshot here. This is the actual additional information notice from the FDA. They're saying we acknowledge the subject device was subject to pen testing. However, it was not adequate. Now, we'll get into how we found this problem, how we fixed it in a little bit. For the most part, it's a straightforward solution. We go through our full round of cybersecurity testing based off of NIST Special Publication 800-115, turned it around quickly, and made sure to get them out the door. But looking at this deficiency notice, and this is why I like to bring this example up, the FDA does not tell you, here is what you need to do. They just say, here's what wasn't good enough. They aren't saying your testing was inadequate because you did not cover XYZ areas. They're just saying your testing was not adequate. And this is partially due to the exploratory nature of cybersecurity testing, but also a little bit just the way that the FDA handles some of these additional information notices. They're often very vague, especially relating to cybersecurity. So not having a comprehensive understanding of what the FDA wants to see, it's going to be increasingly frustrating to try to go through the submission process with vague guidance on how to correct any problems that you might have identified. Now, luckily, in this case, the prospect came to us with this problem. We immediately had a solution. We've seen a lot of these letters come back from the FDA, and we've helped a lot of people get through it. So we know what they're going to expect to see, and we know how to do it, even based off of such vague deficiency notices. But if you don't have experience with it, it can be a lot harder. Remember, this is all that we do. We only have to worry about one thing. But for a manufacturer or for a medtech innovator, there are hundreds of different areas you have to consider. So having a full coverage around this can be a little bit difficult. I'd like to talk about a couple of the key takeaways and some of the main
Hey,
points.
one question real quick, Trevor. What percentage of prospects do you think come to us for those deficiencies you were just talking about today? Because I think it's gone up quite a bit, don't you think?
So we get quite a few coming to us for deficiency response, especially on very tight turnaround. Oftentimes, manufacturers will submit, then they get the full letter from the FDA, and they start going through all of these items. And cybersecurity is one of the last items in eSTAR. So it's one of the last covered items. But like I said, it's one of the more common ones to get rejected for. So very frequently, when manufacturers or when prospects are coming to us, I would say maybe 20 to 30% of the time, they're coming to us for a submission where they're on a timer and they need to make some changes to get through the FDA. They've already tried. Very frequently, when we're going through the first time around, we're typically getting through most of our submissions without so much as a comment from the FDA. Occasionally, we'll get one or two additional information requests, a little bit of clarity on how we came to our risk conclusion or something like that. But getting through this process right the first time is really important. But yeah, I'd say probably around 20 to 30% of our prospects are coming to us for response as opposed to a proactive approach.
Yeah, proactive approach is much better and less stressful, obviously.
Definitely. Now, I will note this has gone down a little bit. I would say beginning of 2024, when this was still super new, it was probably about 50-50 who was coming to us early and who was coming to us at the end. All right, now a couple of these main areas that are really important. If you have to take home anything from this webinar, these are the points here. Cybersecurity should be addressed early and often. Christian always says that's pretty much my tagline, is early and often, but it's very, very important. It's an integral part of your device, and it's not something you could just staple on at the end. Make sure to cover all of your bases at the beginning. Don't leave anything to the last minute. Go through sufficient testing, build out your documentation as you build out your device, and the submission process will be painless. Next thing that we want to see is risk assessments are conducted in line with AMI-TR 57, and risk management approaches are separate and distinct processes with a little bit of that overlap when the situation is appropriate. Again, AMI-TR 57 is going to be for security risk management framework. And while that's our main focus, since we're talking about cybersecurity, be sure that you have your business risk, your financial risk, your safety risk, all built out as separate, distinct processes. Now, tying into some of these original points, bolting on security at the end is not a great way to go about this. This can lead to delays, cost overruns. Your product won't be on the market if you get kicked back by the FDA, and you're going to need to allocate internal funds and resources to fixing it. We want to try to address this by building security out into the product as opposed to just trying to fit it on at the very end. Now, another common area, And this is unfortunately something that a lot of manufacturers won't have control of due to the independent requirement around cybersecurity testing. But cybersecurity testing should include the full scope of the product. So what does that mean? What can cybersecurity, or what can the medical device manufacturers control? Now, penetration testing should be outsourced. The FDA very frequently will request that cybersecurity testing is done by an independent third party, and oftentimes they will require it. As the manufacturer for this product, be sure that you are working with a company specializing and focusing in this medical area. We can go back to one of these case studies that we've discussed, where even though it's done by a third party, this FDA can still kick it back if they see that it was not done in alignment with NIST Special Publication 800-115. If they do not see that patient harm is the paramount consideration, if they do not see objective exploitability metrics, they're going to kick back that testing regardless of who's done it. So be sure that you are working with a company that is familiar with the FDA requirements and that has a comprehensive approach to going through this penetration testing. Of course, this is what we do at Blue Goat all day, every day. And so we're always happy to have a conversation on how we can help you meet your security goals there. It's very important to have special consideration when addressing cybersecurity controls. Building out that not only the documentation, but the actual implementation down to the requirements level is extremely important. We need to cover all of our bases, and for any unique and additional controls that you as a manufacturer have implemented, please build that out into your documentation. It only looks good to the FDA to provide that additional information. There's definitely a balance of providing too much information or not enough as part of your submission, though additional security controls are always going to be important. The last thing that I want to leave you with as part of this webinar is that missing a couple of key areas can open up the rest of the submission to scrutiny. We've seen it happen many times where the FDA finds a thread to pull on and they start working out more and more problems as they identify a single hole in the process. If we have complete coverage and there's nothing for them to grab onto, they aren't going to look twice and they'll submit this through. But the requirement here is that we actually do have coverage on all of these areas. So to make sure that the FDA isn't going to try to scrutinize every single detail of this submission, we need to actually have a quality submission. And this requires that we consider cybersecurity early, have comprehensive and complete testing, and go through the process in a clear, repeatable, and traceable manner.
Awesome. I'll piggyback on something you said there. I think it's important that you don't provide too much documentation. You said it's a balance of having the right amount versus too much. I used to work with a aircraft manufacturer that tried to get approved through the FAA, and they intentionally would just bloat all their documentation, thinking the FAA would just get tired of reading it and approve the aircraft. So I know we've had a couple manufacturers try to do that as well, but it frustrates the FDA from our experience.
Definitely. And oftentimes our cybersecurity submission packets are a lot shorter than you would even expect. Now, the reason for this is we know exactly what information the FDA does care about and then what is going to be considered noise to them. So we can tailor exactly the relevant information for the FDA. And it's been wildly successful for us in the past, having exactly the information they want to see and no bloat around it. They really do appreciate not having to read through 1,800 pages of documentation for the cybersecurity packet. So we try to keep it as concise and to the point as possible.
Concise to the point, so the way it should be. So we'll take questions if anybody has any questions here as well. We'll stick around for a few minutes. Let's see, popping up here on the screen. All right, awesome. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap up this month's webinar, and we hope to see you on next month's webinar, and hope you had found value in this one. All right, thanks everyone.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Trevor. You did most of the work. I just kind of hung out. All right, I'm going to end the stream now.